Welcome back to Killer Stories. I'm your host, Bobby Holmes. This week, I have a story suggestion that was sent in via email by listener Jody Parisi. Jody is from Rochester, New York, and asked me to cover a series of murders that happened there in the 1970s. Today, I am covering the alphabet murders. The victims in this case had something in common. These 3 young girls had first and last names that began with the same letter: Carmen Colon, Wanda Walkowicz, and Michelle Maenza. Hence, why the media dubbed this string of killings as the alphabet murders, also known as the double initial murders. The year is 1971. Hundreds of motorists are driving down Interstate 490 West. 10-year-old Carmen Colon is seen running along the highway. She isn't wearing any pants and seems to be running from a car. Many people witnessed this event, but not one car stopped to see if she needed help or alerted the police. 1971 was very different from today. My first thought in my head now would be that something sinister is happening and this girl needs help. But back then, bad things like that just didn't really happen. Everyone assumed this girl was throwing a tantrum and running away from her dad. Although naked from the waist down would definitely raise suspicion. I mean, it's not like she's a toddler. People tend to think that surely someone will stop and help, but no one did. There were no cell phones, so calling the police wasn't as simple as it is today. The travelers would have to take the nearest exit and find a payphone. Unfortunately, Carmen was not running from her dad. She was running from a child predator. Carmen Colon's family moved to Rochester from Puerto Rico when she was 5 years old. She was one of 6 children. Her first language is Spanish, but caught on to English pretty easily once starting school. At the time of this crime, Carmen's father had passed away, and her family lived with her grandparents. They resided in a sketchy part of town, and typically the grandfather would go along with the children if they were going to leave the house. But one day, Carmen's younger sister needed medicine from the drugstore. Her grandfather wasn't home, and she made the decision to walk to the store alone. She made it to the drugstore and dropped off a prescription. The pharmacist told her it would be ready in about 30 minutes. Carmen said she would be back, but she never came back to pick it up. When Carmen wasn't home by dinner time, her mother and grandparents were extremely worried about her safety. They called the police and reported her missing. About 40 officers went door to door asking if anyone had seen Carmen Colon. They had no idea about Carmen running pantless down the interstate until after she was reported missing. Then people came forward with what they saw. They described the car as a Ford Pinto hatchback. This just goes to prove it doesn't matter how insignificant you think it may be. If your gut tells you something is wrong, please report it. 2 days after Carmen went missing, her body was discovered in the town of Churchville. 2 boys were out riding their bikes and spotted a body lying in the ditch. She was wearing a purple sweater, socks, and sneakers. Just like the motorist described from 2 days earlier, she wasn't wearing any pants or underwear. Her pants were later found on I-490 West, and her coat was lying about 300 feet away from her body. Carmen had been sexually assaulted and strangled to death. Her autopsy revealed a fractured skull and vertebrae. Her skin showed extensive fingernail scratches. Newspapers offered a reward of $2,500 to come forward with any information that could lead to Carmen's killer. Other businesses joined in and upped the reward to $6,000, but any leads were quickly dismissed. One tipster called saying they witnessed Carmen getting into a car outside of the drugstore. It didn't seem as if she was forced to do so, and this led police to believe that she knew her abductor. In early 1972, 5 large billboards could be seen in the Rochester area with a picture of Carmen. It read, "Do you know who killed Carmen Colon?" The billboard listed $6,000 reward and a hotline to call. Someone called the tip line anonymously, stating that a friend of his said, quote, "I did something wrong in Rochester," unquote, and he was going to flee the country. This friend was Miguel Colon, Carmen's uncle. He was both her uncle and stepfather, which I guess means he is the brother of her deceased father, who then married Carmen's mother, Nina. Detectives and a Spanish-speaking translator boarded a plane to Puerto Rico to track down Miguel Colon. He was reportedly living in the San Juan area. By the time they arrived, Miguel had gotten word that they were coming for him and fled again. This time, he was hiding in the vast jungle. The detectives interviewed his family members in San Juan, and his cousin stated that he took a gun with him when he fled. They stayed in Puerto Rico for about a week, hoping he would come out of hiding. Then they had an idea to pull him out. They traveled back to New York and told the media that Miguel's mother was being detained and held for questioning. Miguel couldn't stand the thought of his mother being held in jail and turned himself in. However, this was not an admission of guilt for Carmen's murder. He claimed he was innocent. He was flown back to Rochester and questioned by police. They found a doll presumed to be Carmen's in the backseat of his car. When asked about the doll, Miguel said he wasn't sure if it was Carmen's or one of her sisters. He often gave them rides in his car, and one of them left it in there over the summer. His car had recently been deep cleaned. He told police it was simply because he just liked a clean car. They wondered why he still had the doll in his car if the last time he drove the girls anywhere was in the summer. And Miguel said he just kept forgetting to return it. Definitely suspicious, but does this evidence prove he is guilty of murder? No. He said he fled to Puerto Rico to help his aunt who was sick, but his aunt had miraculously improved once he arrived and went to, quote, be in nature and clear his mind, which is why he was in the jungle when they came looking for him. He took a shotgun with him to hunt small animals for food. Strange weapon of choice for that task. He said he wanted to go back to attend Carmen's funeral, but he had only just arrived in Puerto Rico and flights were too expensive. The strangest part of this whole story is that Miguel left Rochester so abruptly, he didn't even pick up his latest paycheck from his place of employment. And if you were traveling, you would think having that money would be important. Miguel Colon was the number one suspect in this case. But there was not enough evidence to confirm he was the one who raped and murdered Carmen. It was all circumstantial. A second suspect and known child predator, James Barber, also fled Rochester immediately following Carmen's murder. He left without giving notice at his work and didn't bother packing a bag, just up and left. Typically, he uses a punch card at work, but the day Carmen was abducted, James wrote his times in by hand. Even though this was very suspicious that he skipped town, there was little to no evidence actually tying him to the crime. The case grows cold. Just 17 months after Carmen's death, 11-year-old Wanda Walkowicz is playing with a friend on the railroad tracks near her house. Wanda noticed a man watching them from the tree line. For 11 years old, she was extremely street smart and she knew something was wrong. She got her friend's attention, and on the count of 3, they ran all the way home. The girls told their parents what happened, and it was reported to the police. Unfortunately, neither girl got a good look at the man. They only noticed that his shoes had buckles on them. Just 2 days later, Wanda walked down the street to the local deli where she was doing some grocery shopping for her mother. She left the deli carrying a paper bag filled with groceries, including cupcakes for her sister's birthday party the next day. The bag was somewhat heavy, but she didn't have too far to walk. But Wanda never made it home. Her mother, Joyce, grew concerned and sent her sister and a friend to look for her. When they came back empty-handed, her mother went down to the deli. The man at the counter confirmed that Wanda had been there and turned right when leaving the store. It had been over 2 hours since she left, and there was no sign of her or the bag of groceries anywhere. Joyce reported Wanda missing and was taken to a hospital to be treated for shock. She was in total panic at the thought of what happened to her spunky little redhead. There were a few witnesses who saw Wanda after she left the deli. A man who was at the pub across the street saw her exit and start walking. A few of her friends saw her too. They were walking about a block ahead of Wanda. They said she was struggling to get a better grip on her bag of groceries as it was heavy and currently raining. But the next time they turned around to look, she wasn't there, and they just assumed she turned down a different street. Wanda's body was discovered the following day at a rest area in the town of Webster, about 10 miles from her home. She too had been raped and strangled. Wanda was also around the same age as Carmen. Both girls were abducted, sexually assaulted, and strangled. Because of these similarities, the same detective working Carmen's case was assigned to Wanda's. Wanda's autopsy showed that she had recently eaten a custard-like substance. She did not buy any custard while at the deli. Joyce knew with Wanda's street smarts, she would never willingly get into a stranger's car or eat something given by a stranger, which led them to believe she knew her abductor, or it was someone posing as an authority figure. There were no solid leads in Wanda's murder. 7 months later, the child predator struck again. 11-year-old Michelle Maenza was abducted while walking home from school, which is becoming my biggest fear, by the way. My son is begging to walk to and from school. It's like 3 blocks away, and lots of kids in the neighborhood do it, but I can't bring myself to let him. He's about to turn 7, and the thought of something like this happening is just terrifying. Michelle was bullied at school because she was still carrying around some baby fat, as was I at this age. The day she was abducted, Michelle was at recess and accidentally knocked over a sandcastle built by a few other girls in class. They began picking on Michelle and calling her names. Michelle turned around and stomped on the rest of their sandcastle. All of the girls involved were sent to detention after school over the incident. Usually, Michelle's mother, Carolyn, would walk her children to and from school. But because Michelle had detention this day, she walked home alone and unfortunately became a victim of opportunity. 5:30 p.m. came and Michelle still hadn't made it home. This is when Carolyn called police and reported her missing. 2 days after her disappearance, Michelle's body was found in the town of Macedon, lying face down in a ditch. Her coat was found about half a mile away. Her autopsy showed that she was also sexually assaulted and strangled. It is presumed that her killer fed her a cheeseburger. It was consumed an hour and a half before her death. This was the 3rd young girl in a 2-year span to be raped and murdered in the Rochester area. Police now believe these cases are related. White cat hair was found on the clothing of all 3 girls. This solidified the theory that there was a child serial killer on the loose. Another tip line is posted for any information regarding the disappearance or murder of Michelle Maenza. That is when the phone started ringing off the hook. People were seeing a pattern here. The theory is the killer has a thing for alliteration. Carmen Colon, found in Churchville. Wanda Walkowicz, found in Webster. And Michelle Maenza, found in Macedon. The girls' first and last names, as well as the towns they were found, all started with the same letter. Could this simply be a coincidence? Tipsters called in suggesting the initials CMW meant something, or perhaps they should be looking into men who are English teachers. No actual tips or evidence was coming in, just people calling with theories. But then another little girl came forward stating that she saw Michelle the day she went missing. She was in a brown car that was going really fast, more like beige. She mentioned that the driver of the beige car almost hit another car, but kept driving. The media put out a flyer asking for the car who was almost in a fender bender with the beige car to come forward for questioning, but no one ever did. Another man reported that he saw a beige car alongside the road and stopped to see if they needed help. He saw a young girl with him that fit the description of Michelle. When he asked the man if he needed help, he grabbed the, quote, chubby girl and moved her behind him out of sight. He threw his fist up at the Good Samaritan, who quickly backed off. He didn't realize the significance until he saw the news, and he felt confident in giving a description of the man to a sketch artist. Once the sketch was finished, the man agreed it showed resemblance to who he saw that day shielding the young girl along the highway. The flyer was front page news of every newspaper in town. Not long after that, a man entered the police station asking if there had been any updates in the Michelle Maenza case. The officer grabbed the flyer printed with the sketch of the suspect and handed it to him, but the man quickly turned and ran out of the station. He was chased outside and seen speeding away in a beige Ford Pinto. This was their guy. He was just here, inside the police station, and got away. The suspect was even wearing the same quilted blue jacket depicted in the sketch. Another witness came forward stating that she just saw a beige Ford Pinto parked at the drive-in burger joint. A young girl sat inside the car alone while a man then walked out carrying a bag of food and they drove off. This explains the cheeseburger that was consumed before Michelle's death. This witness also got a decent look at the suspect. She gave a description and another sketch was drawn up. The only problem being she had already seen the original sketch, which may have influenced her memory. The sketch turned out basically the exact same as the original, but it was also done by the same artist. The Good Samaritan who stopped to help saw the beige Ford Pinto again, and this time he jotted down the license plate number. Using the license plate number, the suspect was tracked down and brought in for questioning. He was from Lyons, about an hour east of Rochester, New York. He did have a criminal record, but no sexual offenses. Phone records showed he made 2 phone calls from his house the day Michelle went missing, and the timestamp proved there was not enough time for him to be the person responsible and was cleared as a suspect. The local news got wind of the double initial theory and ran a story on it. Before long, it was making national headlines and was dubbed the Alphabet Murders. More similarities between the 3 victims came to light. They were all around 11 years old, came from single-parent homes, were low-income families that followed the Roman Catholic religion. Was all of this just a coincidence? Was it simply just a child predator picking up young girls walking alone in low-income areas who happened to have first and last names starting with the same letter? Or was he methodical with his victims, choosing them by their name? Remember, Wanda saw a man hiding in the tree line just days before she went missing. Was he stalking her? Semen was collected and stored in evidence in all 3 cases, even though at this time it was not something that could be tested like we can today. Over the years, the semen from Carmen and Michelle's case was used up in the beginning stages of bodily fluid testing, but the sample from Wanda's case was left untouched. 20 years after the murder of Carmen Colon, police were called to the home of Miguel Colon, Carmen's uncle, who was initially a suspect. They were called due to neighbors hearing gunshots. When they arrived, they could see Miguel had a gun in his hand. He had shot his wife, Nina, Carmen's mother, and his brother-in-law. Luckily, both their injuries were non-life-threatening. Police ordered Miguel to put down the gun. In return, he just yelled, "Shoot me," over and over. When the police did not comply with his demands, he turned the gun on himself and pulled the trigger. This was determined to be a domestic dispute, but one can't help but wonder if it had anything to do with Carmen's murder. Could Miguel have been responsible after all? And if that's the case, could he have also killed Wanda and Michelle? Having said that, were all 3 girls really linked? While all 3 of them were around the same age, been raped and strangled, there were a few differences. Carmen was the only girl who hadn't eaten directly before her death. She was the only one that was not redressed after being raped, and she was beaten while the others were not. Wanda and Michelle were strangled from behind, but Carmen's killer stood in front of her, watching her take her last breath. The media wants them to be linked to create this double initial or alphabet murder story, but maybe it's just all a coincidence. Let's go back to 1974 to discuss another suspect, Dennis Tremini. Dennis Tremini was a 25-year-old Rochester firefighter with a dark secret. 5 weeks after Michelle's death, Dennis attempted to abduct a 15-year-old girl. She screamed and screamed, causing him to give up and flee the scene. So, he moved on and chose a different victim. But as he was walking a teenage girl into a garage at gunpoint, he was startled by police and took off running. They chased after him, but Dennis made it to his car, where he locked himself inside and put a gun to his temple and pulled the trigger. Dennis was who the newspapers called the garage rapist. Could the garage rapist and the alphabet killer be one and the same? The garage rapist victims ranged from 16 to 40 years old. Could he also have been responsible for raping these pre-teens? The area where Dennis Tremini cruised around in his beige car, seeking his victims, is the same area where Carmen and Wanda went to school, and he lived just half a mile away from Michelle. Inside his car, police found a map that was folded up so the area in view was the town of Webster, where Wanda's body was dumped. Because he was a firefighter, he could have used his authority to trick the girls into his car, making them believe they were safe with him. He sounded like a fit for the rapes and the murders of these young girls, but once forensic science reached a stage where DNA could be tested, his body was exhumed. Dennis Tremini's DNA was not a match for the semen left behind at the crime scenes. Back to square one. And not to mention, this is more than 30 years after the murders that the DNA was finally able to be tested in 2007. One last suspect to discuss, one I'm sure most of you have at least heard of, the Hillside Strangler. And I know what you're thinking. This happened in California, so how can it be linked to these girls in Rochester, New York? Well, the Hillside Strangler was actually a cousin duo, Kenneth Bianchi and Angelo Buono Jr. Together they abducted, raped, and strangled many women. The youngest reported was 12 years old. Initially, it started with the deaths of 3 sex workers who were found strangled and dumped naked on hillsides northeast of Los Angeles between October and early November of 1997. Following this, younger girls were abducted from middle-class neighborhoods and disposed of in the same manner. Kenneth Bianchi was caught after committing a murder without his sidekick. He is the potential suspect for the alphabet murders. Prior to moving to LA, Bianchi lived in Rochester, New York. He had a few different jobs. He sold ice cream, worked as an ambulance driver, and a security guard. He could have lured the girls to his car with ice cream. This would explain why Wanda had a custard-like substance in her stomach. The fact that he was an ambulance driver and a security guard means he would have an authority figure type uniform. This could have tricked even street-smart Wanda Walkowicz into trusting him. But a partial wrist print found at one of the crime scenes was tested against Kenneth Bianchi's, and it was determined not a match. But keep in mind, this was tested 10 years after the murder, and a wrist print isn't quite as definitive as fingerprints. People change sizes, and their skin is constantly shedding. Bianchi admitted to murdering at least 5 women in LA and was already serving life in prison. What would it matter adding 3 more to his rap sheet? But he adamantly denies killing Carmen, Wanda, and Michelle. And now is the part of the story that I know will piss off many of my listeners. This case is still unsolved to this day. I would love to hear your theories on what you think may have happened to Carmen Colon, Wanda Walkowicz, and Michelle Maenza. Do you think one person is responsible for all 3, or are there multiple killers? And is the double initial a methodical plan or just pure coincidence? The part that has me believing that they are related is the white cat hair found on all 3 victims. That, and the odds of the girls having the same first and last initials, as well as the town they were discovered being random, is very, very low. The statistic listed on the podcast Unsolved Murders True Crime Stories is less than 1%, but it is possible. Let me know your thoughts in the comments on YouTube or on my social media networks. I'm on Facebook, Instagram, and TikTok at Killer Stories Podcast, and I'm on Twitter at KillerStoryPod. If you would like to support the show, please leave a rating on Spotify and or a written review on Apple Podcast. You can also leave a one-time donation at buymeacoffee.com/killerstories. Speaking of reviews, I have a 5-star review to share from Ryan from the Valley. Love your podcast. Very interesting stories. Love the team-ups with Stuart. Keep up the great work. Thanks, Ryan. I'll have to get Stu on board for another Killer British Murder Stories collab. Next week, I have a very special episode planned. I will have a guest host, Jennifer Barlow. Jennifer has taken the past 8 months off to write a book about her uncle she believes was wrongly convicted of a murder that took place in 1996. So be sure to tune in next week. You won't want to miss it. As always, thanks for listening. Until next time, this has been a Killer Story.